Every time he made a mistake, his uncle would severely punish him. Although the physical pain was intense, he still gritted his teeth and endured it. Because Andreas never cried, his uncle would strike even harder with the cane. During mealtime, his uncle never let him sit at the table. Andreas had to hide in a corner of the kitchen, eating the special food given to him. After both his parents passed away, his uncle's 4 children constantly excluded and bullied him. The only one in the house who felt sorry for him was his grandmother. In her spare time, she would secretly teach him how to read, and this allowed Andreas to gain knowledge early on, even in an era where education was scarce. One day, Andreas overturned a cart while moving hay, and his uncle punished him again. But this time, the punishment shocked everyone. His uncle actually broke Andreas's right leg. From that day on, Andreas was left with a lifelong disability. When his uncle heard the news, he showed no remorse at all and simply turned around and left without a word. His grandmother sat beside him, comforting him with a helpless sigh. Perhaps, like all pain in life, these wounds would slowly heal over time. Under both physical and emotional torment, Andreas endured silently until the age of 18. Now he was a handsome and strong young man, but the years of suffering still haunted him. Only his grandmother's kind and gentle smile could offer him a sense of warmth and love. Finally, not long after, Andreas received a conscription letter. He thought this would be his chance to escape the hellish life, but his uncle wanted him to stay and inherit the farm. So, he took Andreas to the recruitment office. Since both of his sons had died of diphtheria, he refused to let his only adopted son go to war. Given the special circumstances of their family, the recruitment office agreed to let Andreas stay. Although Andreas disagreed with his uncle's decision, he was powerless to change it. But one day, something unexpected happened. His grandmother passed away while kneading dough. Her sudden death devastated Andreas and strengthened his determination. That evening, he smashed a plate at the dinner table to release the anger that had been building inside him for years. At last, after years of scars and silence, Andreas completely broke ties with his uncle. He stood up to his uncle's punishment for the first time in his life and spoke the first meaningful words he had ever uttered.
Wenn du mich schlagst, bring ich dich um.
After the confrontation, Andreas left the house for good. He packed his belongings and started a new life on the other side of the town. He earned a living by plowing fields and chopping wood for the villagers. After years of tireless labor and saving, Andreas had built up some modest savings by the time he turned 29. One day, by chance, he discovered a rundown cabin halfway up the mountain. In front of the cabin lay a frozen deer, clearly showing that no one had lived there for a long time. Inside, Andreas found an old man, barely alive and nearly frozen to death. Out of kindness, Andreas tried to carry the old man down the mountain for medical help, but the man didn't want him to take that risk. Catching a cold from sweating in the snow could be extremely dangerous. The old man said death wasn't a terrible thing. People often said that death brought new life, but the old man believed death brought nothing, only a deeper, colder silence. Then, when Andreas wasn't looking, the old man slipped away into the snowy forest. Andreas didn't go after him. Instead, he returned to town and ordered a drink at the local tavern. Staring into the flames of the fireplace, he couldn't stop thinking about the old man's final words. In that tavern worked a beautiful waitress named Marie, and Andreas was enchanted by her the moment he laid eyes on her. To win her affection, he used his years of savings to rent a small cabin halfway up the mountain. At last, Andreas had a home of his own. Every morning, he would stand in front of his cabin, gazing at the endless Alps. He cleared a patch of land near the cabin to grow vegetables and fruit. By then, the Alps had become increasingly popular with investors. Many businessmen came to invest in the area, to attract more tourists and offer a view of the entire valley. Several large companies began building cable cars. The villagers were excited, as this would bring them more income and usher the town into a new era. One day, after working in the fields, Andreas met Marie along the path, feeding her chickens. Seeing her graceful figure once again stirred emotions in Andreas's heart. Though no words passed between them, their hearts seemed to beat in unison. As usual, Andreas went to the tavern for a drink, and the bartender, noticing Andreas's gaze fixed on Marie, couldn't help but tease him.
Die Marie schon für die Arbeit, nicht für die Liebe, verstehst?
Although the bartender spoke that way, Marie's expression told Andreas she wasn't as heartless as the bartender claimed. Finally, on a day with a sky so blue and clouds so light, Andreas dressed in a suit and stood in front of the church. The majestic Alps seemed to give him courage as he quietly waited for the girl who had haunted his dreams. When Marie saw him there, she hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked toward him. But just as he was about to speak, nervous and trembling,
Ich möchte.
Ja?
Marie answered before he could even finish. The two of them strolled through the Alps and arrived at Andreas's little cabin. The winding trail and steep slope left Marie breathless, but the breathtaking view left her in awe. The birdsong and blooming flowers made it feel like Marie had stepped into a fairy tale. Andreas introduced her to his garden and the majestic scenery nature had gifted him. The sunlight here was much more abundant than in the valley, perfect for growing plants and healing weary hearts and limbs. Inside the cabin, Andreas had crafted many of the everyday items himself, and he eagerly shared their stories with Marie. The only thing he didn't plan to build was a cattle barn because he didn't want to raise cattle or become a farmer. His grandmother had once told him that becoming a farmer meant a lifetime of toil on one's land. Marie didn't criticize his thoughts, only replying with a simple indeed. As more investors came to the town, the demand for workers kept rising. Andreas also hoped to get a job, but due to his physical disability, most companies refused to hire him. Eventually, he managed to join the workforce. He worked hard day and night to earn his wages. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye, but Marie and Andreas's love remained as strong as ever. She often visited his mountain cabin, and together they admired the stunning beauty of the Alps. To Marie, the mountains looked as beautiful as fine porcelain. Finally, Andreas couldn't hold back anymore. He kissed Marie for the first time. The kiss was wild and passionate, like a fire ignited in the wilderness. Marie was caught off guard by his sudden gesture. The mountain winds whispered softly through the valleys, carrying their longing and affection. He wanted to write his love on the mountaintops, for the whole world to see. To do so, Andreas asked his friends from the construction site for help. He wanted to express his love for Marie in a special way. Finally, on the evening of his 35th birthday, Andreas invited Marie to walk with him in the Alps. Andreas wanted to show Marie something she would never forget. A gentle breeze swept across the mountains, and the grass continued to rustle. Andreas and Marie sat quietly on the meadow. As soon as Andreas finished speaking, a blaze of fire lit up on the mountaintop across from them. The shape of the flames shifted depending on the angle, revealing the special surprise Andreas had prepared for Marie. At last, the two lovers became husband and wife, and Andreas carried Marie holding a bouquet into their cabin. That night, the gentle Andreas softly caressed his wife and promised to protect and care for her with all his heart for the rest of his life. To provide Marie with a better life, Andreas took on several extra jobs from the foreman at the construction site. He worked tirelessly and without complaint, and the boss was quite pleased with his performance. As a result of his hard work, his wages doubled. Thanks to the perseverance of countless workers, the first cable car was soon completed. The town finally had electricity, and life became better for everyone. Andreas and Marie's relationship grew even deeper. One day, Marie came running to Andreas in a panic, but when she saw her husband busy at work, she became too excited to speak. Finally, Andreas and Marie had a child of their own, but their happiness didn't last long. On a winter night, Andreas felt the ground trembling beneath his feet. He stepped outside and saw the entire valley blanketed by an invisible force. He quickly turned back to call out to his sleeping wife, but a massive avalanche buried Andreas in an instant. It wasn't until the next morning that Andreas slowly regained consciousness. He struggled with all his strength to crawl out of the snow, and though he shouted until his voice broke, there was no response. Fighting through the pain of his fractured legs, he climbed upward desperately, but he never found his wife or child. Soon after, Andreas was discovered by local villagers, and the next time he saw his beloved wife was at her funeral in the town's church. Andreas collapsed to the ground, powerless, staring blankly at everything around him like a puppet who had lost its soul. In this world, aside from his deceased grandmother, Marie and their child had been Andreas's only family. For years, mental fatigue and physical suffering continued to torment the already battered young man. Eventually, with the help of the tavern owner, the badly injured Andreas slowly recovered while resting in bed. From that moment on, Andreas began writing letters to his wife. He recorded everything that happened to him on slips of paper and placed them by hand into Marie's coffin. Soon, his legs began to heal, and he returned to his diligent work at the construction site. One day, a tragic accident occurred. A worker fell asleep while soaking in hot water, only to be found frozen solid the next morning. Scars are like the passage of time, one after another, and all suffering shapes a person. Not long after, war broke out, and with no family left to hold him back, Andreas decided to enlist. Before leaving, he visited his wife's grave, offered her a bouquet of beautiful flowers, and then went to the enlistment office. Due to his physical condition and his technical repair skills, Andreas was sent to the Eastern Front. There, he helped establish a camp in the mountains, providing cover for retreating comrades. But after countless days and nights, the army forgot about Andreas and left him in the remote camp. He stayed on the mountain alone for a long time, until he reached the point of desperation and had no choice but to surrender to the enemy. In prison, he was tortured, yet he never stopped writing letters to his wife. Though the winters there were far harsher than at home, Andreas never complained. This life continued until the war finally ended, and Andreas was released back to the Alps. By then, he was well into middle age, the years etched deep into his face. Upon returning to the town, the first thing Andreas did was visit his wife's grave. He dug through the living soil and placed the letters he had written over the years into Marie's coffin. Afterward, he went to the tavern, but it was no longer the same as before. Time had passed, and everything had changed. Andreas could never return to the past, though his uncle's old house still stood, and he could almost hear his grandmother's loving guidance in his ears. Those memories lived only in his heart. In front of the old house, he met his uncle from years ago. Now an old man, his uncle still recognized Andreas by the sound of his footsteps. Though he still spoke with the same harsh tone, his frail body looked like it could crumble at any moment. He clutched Andreas's hand with all his strength, but Andreas didn't respond. He turned and walked away without hesitation. With the tavern owner's help, Andreas became a farmer once more. Even though it had once been the job he hated most, he did it for 20 years. Now Andreas was an old man with white hair, a beer belly, and worn-out clothes, living alone like any ordinary elder. Yet his soft, kind eyes had never changed, still carrying a trace of grace and tenderness. Due to changing times, the cabin in the mountains was scheduled for demolition, but the tavern owner continued to rent it to Andreas. However, he only lived on the lower floor upstairs. The tavern owner had rented it out to a school. Inside the school were cheerful children and a single elderly woman who happened to share Andreas's name. The old lady saw Andreas's hard work and kindness, and she reached out to him with warmth. The two tried to build a relationship, but Andreas eventually turned her down, because in his heart, he loved only one woman, his wife Marie. All these years, Andreas had never stopped writing letters, and no one could compare to the love he had for his wife. The seasons passed like poetry, each change carrying nature's unique rhythm. Andreas spent day after day alone. He watched the cable cars carry crowds of tourists up and down the Alps. He smiled at the thought of astronauts walking on the moon and inhaled the endless fragrance of the wildflowers. After enduring the passage of time, Andreas had finally grown old, and his body was beginning to weaken. One cold winter, he saw a truck carrying a dried corpse. To his surprise, he was overjoyed, for it was the old man from 40 years ago, the one who had told him death brought nothing but cold. After 40 years, the old man still wore a smile, clearly happy when death finally came. Time flew by, and many more years passed. Now at the end of his life, Andreas stopped a bus in the middle of town. Outside the window, the scenery of the Alps flew by: blue skies, white clouds, snow-capped peaks, lakes, forests, and wildflowers. This natural palace held the history and culture of all of Europe, where nature and humanity intertwined endlessly before his eyes. Nearly 80, Andreas looked out at the endless beauty and reflected on his life. Looking back, his life was filled with countless twists and challenges, but each experience shaped the man he became. His life was like a painting, each color representing a stage in his journey, together forming a masterpiece that was uniquely his. Like a script full of highs and lows, his youth burned with passion, his middle age with calm, and now in old age, he had learned to treasure peace and beauty. It wasn't until he stepped off the bus that he realized just how old he had become. In his youth, he could stand in the snow in a thin wool sweater and feel nothing, but now, even the breeze of the Alps made him shiver. Standing on the viewing platform, he gazed at the snowy peaks and green meadows as memories flashed before his eyes. At home, Andreas once again picked up pen and paper to write to his wife. Now nearly 80, Andreas had finally reached the end of his journey. In his final moments, he was still looking at the towering Alps. After his death, the tavern owner buried him beside Marie. The heavy coffin accidentally damaged the corner of Marie's coffin, and the letters he had written over the past 40 years fluttered onto Andreas's casket like butterflies, as if his departed wife were embracing the man who had struggled through life. With his long and painful life, Andreas proved how thoroughly death can cover and dissolve everything. He no longer remembered where he came from, nor did he know where he was going. In this strange, almost poetic way, he looked back on his life, and if his life had not been so full of hardship, Andreas might have known the joy of pure happiness. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.